spiritual food for thought. Welcome back to Spiritual Food for Thought. I thank you for joining me once again, and in this video I want to highlight what could possibly be the dumbest comment that I've ever received in response to any of my videos that I ever put out. And this is not an attack on the person who made this comment, but this is using the comment as an example and pointing out some stuff of how far people will go and the absurd length that they will push themselves to in an opportunity to fight against certain things from God and His law that they just don't want to apply to their life. They're willing to, even from their point of view, probably throw out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, this is getting super messed up. I cannot believe they said it when they did. I decided to screenshot it right away. That way, even if they repented of it and changed their mind and came back and deleted it or edited it, because it crossed their mind at some point and they took the time to type it out and press like send, like here it exists now, because they were willing to go through with all of that, maybe this is not exclusive to them. You know, maybe this isn't just an idea that they would have, so I wanted to kind of capture it and use it as an example to show a false idea, a false equation, a false belief, an irrational length to which some people are willing to go just to try to justify themselves. The stuff that comes out of their mouth sometimes, they cannot be thinking when they speak it. They've been so indoctrinated and brainwashed and trained just to reject things that God calls holy, to reject things that God says are important. They've been so trained to just vehemently hate that and reject it that they say some incredibly stupid stuff. I know stupid's kind of a strong word, but I mean just complete lack of intelligence. They're not even thinking about what they say, because if they did, they would never speak it. And that's one reason why I first saw the comment, I screenshotted it. I was completely just dumbfounded when I saw it, and used it as a great example too, just me interacting with my wife, teaching my children, saying, guys, look at this. Like, do you see how inconsistent this is? But they also kind of bring forth a good point. So again, I'm not against this individual, but rather the idea that they expressed. And it's this idea that I find so erroneous and so dangerous. So let's take a look at the comment. So the comment was, the 10 Commandments are part of the entire Jewish law. You can't just pick the Sabbath out of there unless you're saying we should observe that too. The that too, although poorly phrased, the entire law is what they're pointing to there. And they're saying, well, you can't just say because the Sabbath was one of the 10 Commandments that we should do that, because the 10 Commandments are just part of the entire Jewish law, and you can't just pick something out of the 10 Commandments and say we should do that unless you want to obey it all. Interesting. Now, it's not worded the best, and there's just some inaccurate things in their wording, but basically, they've seen me talk about the Sabbath before, and talk about how all 10 of the 10 Commandments are things that I believe are important. The majority of the modern church will say 9/10. 9/10 is really important, but this holy one we're supposed to remember forever throughout our generations, that we'll get rid of. And these other 9 are really good. That's what they say. It's not what I say. I say all 10. But this person points out that all 10 of those 10 Commandments are just part of what God revealed in the Old Testament law. He says Jewish law here, which is really one of those false ideas. I'm going to have to break this down for you guys in the future. But the law wasn't for the Jews. Jews aren't even mentioned until like 2 Kings in Scripture. If the Torah, if the law that God gives is for the Jews, then Jews should be mentioned there, but it's not. And Jews is not synonymous with Israel. Now, Israel was 12 tribes. One of those tribes was Judah. Okay? Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, therefore he was a Jew. Also, when they split into the northern and southern kingdoms, you have 10 tribes up north, 2 tribes down south. Which 2 tribes down south? Benjamin and Judah. That's why you have Mordecai the Jew, even though he was a Benjaminite, it was his association with the southern kingdom in the book of Esther that he's called a Jew for. And same thing with Paul in the New Testament, of the tribe of Benjamin, but he was a Jew associated with the southern kingdom.
The other tribes had gone into dispersion and they never came back. So you could be born of the tribe of Judah and be a Jew. You could be associated with the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, and be a Jew. And you could also fall under Judaism. Now, Judaism is not synonymous with the Old Testament commandments of God. How do we know that? Well, read like Matthew 15. Read Mark 7. See what Jesus says about Judaism in his day. That they reject the commandments of God to follow their own traditions. People are often going to lie about the scribes and Pharisees and say, oh, nobody kept the law like they did. Not according to Jesus. According to Jesus, they didn't keep the law. They followed their own traditions. So I'm going to believe that he's right and people are lying to me. But Judaism, if somebody was going to fall into Judaism, okay, not the Old Testament commands that God commanded, but their own belief system and religion, that's another way for them to be a Jew. There was a time where Paul fell into Judaism. Okay? He was never of the tribe of Judah, but he was in Judaism, and even when he left Judaism, he was still the tribe of Benjamin associated with the southern kingdom, so he was still a Jew at that point. Jesus, of the tribe of Judah, therefore also associated with the southern kingdom, but never into Judaism. He obeyed God and everything that God commanded in the Old Testament, but he was not a Jew because of Judaism. He was a Jew because he was from the tribe of Judah. So these are distinctions that I think are very important, and Israel was the overarching all of God's people, okay? Judah was one of the 12 tribes. So to use Jew and Israel synonymous is inaccurate. It doesn't hold up to Scripture, and it's inaccurate. So when people say, oh, the Jewish law, they're just trying to distance themselves from the commandments of God. And this person is trying so hard to distance themselves from the things that God commanded that they're willing to throw out all 10 of the 10 commandments. I'll probably dive in deeper to that in the future, but there is no Jewish law outside of Judaism. And those laws are not synonymous with the Old Testament laws that God gave for all of his people. It wasn't just the nation of Israel, it was anyone who would come in. There was one law for the native born and for the stranger who sojourned among them. When Ruth goes, your God will be my God and your people will be my people, she's making a declaration of faith. And by joining herself to the nation of Israel, which is God's people, then she joined herself to obeying his commands. That's how that works. Same thing with Rahab. When she chose to join herself to the nation of Israel, God's people, then the laws for God's people applied. They didn't say, no, you're a Gentile. No, you're from the heathen. It's not what they said. They welcomed them in, but then with welcoming in, they had to obey. There was one law for God's people. Not one law for the Jews, one law for everyone else. One law for God's people who were not the Jews. They were all of Israel. The tribe of Judah fit into that. But it wasn't the whole of it. So that right there is a false statement. But moving past there, here's the part I want to focus on. You can't just pick the Sabbath out of there unless you're saying we should observe that too. So by observe that too, they mean the entirety of the Old Testament laws, which is absolutely ridiculously insane to speak from their mouth for this reason. They're saying you can't say the Sabbath is important unless you want to obey everything God commanded. Really? So can they say, you shall not lie, shall not bear false witness? Is that important? And do they hold themselves to the same standard? Are they able to say, yeah, we should tell the truth without obeying the entirety of what God commands in the Old Testament? Because I would argue and reason that, yeah, the vast majority of modern believers would say we shouldn't lie. And I want you to ask yourself for a moment, does that sound like something that a modern believer should do? That we should try to justify rejecting the Sabbath, and which is one of the 10 commandments, by just rejecting all the other 9 commandments too? That's kind of dangerous, isn't it? I mean, I wouldn't expect people in the modern church to really go for that. But this person drives it to that length because he's heard me emphasize that, well, the Sabbath is important.
God says it's holy. We shouldn't profane it. He tells us to remember it. He says it's a sign between him and his people. He says it's forever, throughout all the generations. In the future, we see that he expects everyone to worship him on the Sabbath. In the future, when he comes back and rules and reigns. It seems important to me. And I go, I mean, it's one of the 10 Commandments. You go, oh, well, the 10 Commandments are part of the Jewish law. You can't say that, the Sabbath is important unless you want to obey them all. That's a really interesting take. Okay, because although they only use the Sabbath as the example, and that's what they're trying to dismiss, if we're just going to say you can't pick anything from the 10 Commandments, because if picking one thing is wrong, well then picking one other thing is wrong too. Then blasphemy is okay, adultery is okay, lying's okay, stealing's okay, murder is okay, disobeying your parents is okay.
So this formula here that he created is erroneous and wrong. Same thing with murder. Can this guy say you shouldn't murder without wanting to obey all the Old Testament laws that God has? It's so stupid to say. And if he thought about it, he would never say it. But he hates the holy day of God so much. He rejects it so outrightly. So I'm not even willing to doubt that I'm wrong or consider that God is right. That he's going to come up with this type of scenario. Oh, well, the Sabbath's just one of the 10 Commandments, and the 10 Commandments are part of the law that God gave the Jews. So I don't want to be a Jew. I'm going to reject it all. That's ridiculous. That is incredibly foolish. Is this an adulterous man I'm dealing with? Does he want to be justified in his adultery, so he's trying to reject all of God's law? Well, no, I don't think that's the case. But what he's saying is you can't obey any of the 10 Commandments without thinking you have to obey it all. I've encountered this mentality before, and just for a frame of reference and some good food for thought, I would recommend you check out this video. But basically what you have is a man who springs to fame quickly, and I don't think had a very long walk with the Lord, but immediately when somebody's famous and they become a believer, then they're the ones we want speaking at conferences, and they're the ones we want putting out videos. They're the ones we want to sit here at their feet and hear what they have to say, even though they don't really have a frame of reference. It's not their understanding of truth that got them where they are. They got famous some other way, and then they became a believer. So now since they're a famous believer, let's hear what they say. And this man very ignorantly says a lot of stuff where he's adding to and taking away from Scripture, and he's making some really bad claims. I'll insert a short excerpt right now to give you a frame of reference.
Classic disagreement with tattoos is in Leviticus. Now, I'll just read that verse real quick and we'll chat about it. So this is the only verse that pretty much people can go to in the Old Testament that talks about tattoos. And it says this. It says, out of context, it says in Leviticus 19 verse 28, you shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourselves, for I am the Lord. If the people quote this to me, then I would hope they also live up to the rest, because if they're going to live up to that, then why not the other ones in the passage as well, right?
So this is one of the very first things that he kind of says as a justification for, well, it says not to get tattoos, but I got tattoos, and he reasons that if somebody's going to, say you shouldn't get tattoos, then they should live up to the rest of these verses too. And that's a very interesting thing in Christianity these days, is a lot of what you find in the Old Testament, people are going to agree with. It's just going to resonate with them. Other people are going to agree with some things that others don't disagree with, and then some of it is reiterated in the New Testament. But he says, if you're going to say I shouldn't get tattoos, then you need to obey the rest of this stuff too. Listen to some of the things that come out here in Leviticus 19, because it starts off with and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say unto them, ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You shall fear every man his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Turn ye not unto idols, nor make yourselves molten gods. I am the Lord your God. And at the very end of it, he says, therefore, you shall observe all my statutes and all my judgments and do them. I am the Lord. So sometimes chapters aren't really put in the best places. The chapter breaks. But here, from the 19:1 to the end of 19, there is a snippet. And it's a pretty good chapter as far as to break something, out of Scripture and say, okay, here's a chapter. But anything else in this whole Leviticus 19, there's some things that people don't know what to do with. There's other things that are part of the 10 Commandments. So if you're going to say, oh, well, don't tell me not to get tattoos unless you're going to obey everything in this chapter, from the modern Christian mindset, which is his mindset, would you say the same if somebody told you not to worship idols? Would you say, oh, well, you can't tell me to obey Leviticus 19:3 unless you're going to obey everything else in this chapter? Okay, you can't say, oh, here it says, fear your mother and your father, pretty much to honor your mother and father. Are you going to say, oh, well, I don't have to do that? Because unless you want to obey everything else in the verse, you head up to something like verse 14. Thou shalt not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but thou shalt fear thy God. I am the Lord. Are you going to say, oh, well, I can put stumbling blocks in front of the blind, and I can curse the deaf? I mean, unless you're going to tell me I have to obey everything else here too. Or look at verse 11. You shall not steal, neither deal falsely, neither lie to one another. So there's so much in this chapter that we know is true, that we know God wants us to obey. So to say, oh, you can't tell me to obey anything in this chapter unless you're going to obey it all, even from the modern Christian mindset, which is going to pick and choose through this whole thing what applies and what doesn't, it's a flawed argument. So what he's basically doing is saying, oh, in Leviticus 19, it says we shouldn't have tattoos. Well, you can't obey anything in Leviticus 19 without having to obey it all. And he drives some things to some very false distances, saying, oh, well, then you can't eat meat.
So just a few verses above it, it says, you shall not eat any flesh with blood in it. If you're the person quoting to me that I can't get tattoos, then you hopefully also are the person not eating any fruit or vegetable that has not been cultivated for at least 3 years. And on top of that, you don't eat any meat, because all meat has some form of either dried blood, or if it's medium rare, totally normal blood in the meat.
And if you want to eat meat, you shouldn't say my tattoos are wrong. And he just makes all these incredibly illogical claims in an attempt to justify himself. I think it's the same thing here, that this man is trying to justify himself in rejecting God's holy day, his Sabbath, that he says mattered, and he says is going to matter in the future. And it mattered in the New Testament. And he wants to reject it so bad that he's got to justify himself. Because if you actually looked at the Ten Commandments, it's there. In fact, it's the one on which God puts the most emphasis. He gives 4 verses each time to the Sabbath in the Ten Commandments.
And he gives 4 words to murder. He gives 5 words to adultery. Just 4 words to stealing.
And from my point of view, I would say, right, we should keep all the 10 Commandments. And we should keep all the laws of God that apply to us.
This is the point that people push themselves to. This guy wants to reject the Sabbath so bad that he's willing to throw out all 10 of the 10 Commandments. Now, on the flip side of that, if we get rid of the Jewish law idea, which is false there, well, I do think that his feast days are important. I do think that his law about what is food and is not food is important. I do think that when he says the Sabbath, that he means the Sabbath. And that's what's important to him. And that's the day he set apart as holy, that he told us not to profane. Yeah, I do. I do think we should be obeying a lot more of it. And even if you actually looked into what those laws were that happened to be earlier in the book, I mean, unless you're struggling with not having sex with your aunt, I don't think this is some big heavy burden. Unless you're wrestling with not prostituting your daughter, I mean, that's in the Old Testament, that's done away with, that got nailed to the cross. There's a lot of false ideas that people throw up to try to distance themselves and dismiss these things. But I find it to be very dangerous and incredibly foolish. And when somebody, from a modern church-going mindset, to be willing to throw out the 10 Commandments, I don't think you could be a believer if you don't think you're supposed to be honest, if you don't think you're not supposed to commit adultery, if you don't think you're not supposed to murder, if you don't think you're not supposed to steal, if you don't think you're not supposed to blaspheme, that you should honor your parents, that you should not have idols, that you should keep God first and foremost and have no other gods before him. How could you be a believer if you say that those things are bad? or those things are for the Jews, those things are for somebody else. To me, that's absolutely ridiculous and dangerous, and that's why I think this is one of the stupidest comments I've ever read in my life, because it doesn't even make sense from his point of view, but he's not thinking about what he's saying. He's just trying to distance himself from obedience. Again, I'm not trying to convince anyone here. I'm just saying whatever your own personal conviction is, it should be consistent. And if out one side of your mouth you speak one thing, and then you do the exact opposite, or you speak the exact opposite out of the other side of your mouth, that's going to be a witness against you. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And I'm not looking just to follow the traditions of men here. I don't care what man says about Sunday. I really don't. Because I would rather obey God than man. And I have my reasons for doing that. And I would rather not have a testimony like the Pharisees have, where Jesus is willing to say, wow, you make the commandments of God of none effect by your own traditions. You throw out what God says so you can do your own thing. But time and time again, I think that's exactly what I see the modern church doing.
The lengths that some people will go to in an attempt to justify themselves is amazing. Here, this man says you can't obey anything off the Ten Commandments. He uses the Sabbath as an example, and the Sabbath is all he's really focused on. He's not thinking about idolatry here. He's not saying, well, I can go build little idols to false gods. He's not trying to say that. He's just trying to get rid of the Sabbath, but in doing so, he just threw out all other 9 of the 10 Commandments. I'm not sure that people that locked into their train of thought are ever going to come out. I know that many people will fight against things like the Sabbath tooth and nail until they die. And apart from God stepping in and convincing them otherwise, that's the path that they're on. But just to reject it because it's common or because that's what man tells you to do, I think is very foolish and dangerous. For the rest of you out there, I hope that this makes sense. Look at the absurd, illogical, dangerous, unbiblical, foolish, and dumb lengths that people will go to in an attempt to dismiss something that God says is holy. God says to remember. God says is a sign between him and his people. And here's where it gets tricky. People will say, oh, well, that was just for him and the Jews. And by the Jews, they mean Israel. But they don't realize that Israel was all of his people. The mixed multitude that came out of Egypt, the people who saw their gods being laid waste and saying, okay, that's the true God, we're going to go worship and follow him. They repented of their ways. They stopped worshiping false gods and joined themselves unto Israel. Rahab joined herself unto Israel. She left the ways of Jericho behind. Ruth rejected her Moabite identity and joined herself to Israel and became part of God's people. So when he says this is a sign between me and my people, but he makes no distinction between the native born or the stranger who sojourns amongst them, or the one who comes in from the nations and says, I want to serve the real God. It was always whosoever will. So they join themselves unto it. It becomes for them too. And then in the New Testament, he says he's not making a distinction between the Jews and the Gentiles, between the Jews and the Greeks. He's saying that there's one law for all. So how do we reconcile those two? If he says this is for his people forever, and then the New Testament they say, oh yeah, but not anymore. Now we're a different his people. And if one of those his people becomes his people, I never thought about that. And I've had conversations with people, and that's what they say. I say, well, what do you do with this? I never thought about that. I believe you. I believe you. It's far from the mind of a lot of modern believers to even consider that, because they're not trained to think about how these things are all true. They say those aren't true anymore. That fits in a different category. That's for somebody else. And they reject a lot of the Bible in the past. They reject a lot of the Bible in the future. And it's only this church age of grace, which by their own mouths, the theologians, pre-tribulationalist theologians will say the church age of grace, not the subject of any Old Testament prophecy. What does that mean? I thought he wasn't going to do anything without revealing it to his servants, the prophets, first. But this time period, the church age of grace, is not the subject of any Old Testament prophecy. And that's what they say. That's what like Thomas Ice, Tim LaHaye people say. And then they take a look and they say, oh, we're in the new covenant now. Did you ever read about the new covenant? Because if the new covenant that you think you're in is not the one prophesied of, I want to know how many new covenants you think there are. Because I believe full well that when Jesus says this is the new covenant in my blood, that he's pointing to the one prophesied of. And if your belief about what the new covenant is has nothing to do with the one that's prophesied of, I believe that's a made up, false new covenant. Maybe that wasn't the subject of any Old Testament prophecy, which means it's unbiblical. It's ungodly. It's not the one he's talking about. These are dangerous, slippery slopes, to the point that some people make statements that apparently, if taken literally, he wants to reject all 10 of the 10 commandments. Because by this man's own mouth, with his dumb statement that he made, without realizing it, because I don't think it's what he believes, but that's what he just claimed, that you can reject all 10 of the 10 commandments and be just fine with God. I seriously hope none of you are dumb enough to believe that. And I seriously hope that you guys just take a step back, start with the Bible, and see what God says about these matters. I'm just trying to say what this guy is saying is absolutely wrong. So what's true? What is true? Well, his word is truth. So if you're going to find out what the truth is, I would highly recommend starting there. Be blessed. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.